Ukraine unveils a cruise missile, and not just any missile, but a long-range one. And it does so when it strongly benefits the Kiev regime. Right in the midst of those negotiations, this time between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky in the background, with European leaders also attending the negotiations in question. Although I couldn't tell you to what extent, since they have every right to give their opinion. But the main thing, from the Kiev regime, they declare a range of 3,000 kilometers. And so they somehow reveal the mystery of this missile that they say is already in production. And therefore it would be a real game changer in this conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation. Is it really like that? We'll immediately look at the main features of the missile in question, as well as the scenarios, because I've made sure to talk to my sources here directly in Donbass. And so I asked them what will end up being the consequences. The reaction from the Russian Federation, because the official one still hasn't arrived, but that's actually the non-response. We'll get to the details in a moment, but first I have to announce that in the upcoming reports. The setting for them is going to change constantly. Since we're going on a trip looking for content, I hope it's very interesting for you. We're going to visit that absolutely unique economic zone within the Russian Federation, which is called Lavuga. And first of all, it represents something like the Silicon Valley of Russia. Nowadays, that's where the country's top minds are, and not only working, but also being trained. That's first of all. Secondly, most likely, if you know the area in question, you know it because they make drones there. I'll leave it at that, Garant. And well, as soon as we set out on our trip, little by little, I'll tell you more. Things about the trip itself. Most likely, they'll start appearing on my personal channel. I remind you about Lucivaya, but of course, I'll also be showing you a few glimpses here as well. That being said, regarding the main features of the missile in question, a long-range cruise missile. 6 tons in total, and out of those 6, 1 ton is the weight of the warhead. 950 kilometers per hour in speed, 3,000 kilometers in range, 5,000 meters in flight altitude. Yes, indeed, it seems like an extremely powerful piece. Ukraine has already shown the first images. They claim that it is in production, but the thing is that it has certain similarities with several models, one of them surprisingly Soviet. That would be the Tu-143 race, which in fact the Kiev regime was already using for its attacks in 2022. And also, oh my god, it has so many other similarities with the missile. Do you see a German one? This first, and here we could deduce that maybe these agreements that the Kiev regime has been signing lately with Germany are already bearing their first fruits. Surprisingly, no. A former regime? A favorite of a famous Austrian painter, let's call him that, and another regime in the present, well, absolutely a fan of the same original regime. They have come together and are now manufacturing weapons to attack the Russian Federation together, presumably, of course. But also, behind this Ukrainian missile, it seems there is an English company, specifically from the United Kingdom, which is Millennium Group 8, registered in the United Kingdom in the year 2020. This is what we know as of today. And also, the missile in question was already presented at an exhibition in the United Arab Emirates. It did so, if I'm not mistaken, as FP Cinco Millennium or something similar. That is to say, what is now being presented as a creation of the best minds of Ukraine is very likely not really that. And therefore, especially if we add to that the moment when the mystery of the missile in question was revealed, It represents an attempt, at least, at a media coup now that Ukraine is in an extremely weak position. With that constant advance of the Russian Federation on the Ukrainian front, which we will talk about in upcoming reports. But let's move on to what we've been discussing in previous reports, because now this advance has been confirmed. From 10 to 18 kilometers, depending on the source talking about this issue. And in fact, some German sources mention 18 kilometers, not even Russian sources. On the Donetsk front, so really, both on the Konstantinovka front, this part of Konstantinovka on the Donetsk front, and on the Pakrovsk front, the Pakrovsk part of the Donetsk front, once again, things are getting worse by the moment in the Russian Federation. It has already had an initial operational success because it found a very weak point in the Ukrainian defense and was able to break through it. But of course, the main point here is that this little gap they found is not the only weak point in the Ukrainian defense, not by a long shot. In other words, such significant advances are likely to occur more frequently in the future. So at an absolutely critical moment. Also, especially in terms of international image, when Vladimir Putin was received in the United States with a red carpet. So the Kiev regime brings out this Flamingo missile to try to somehow change the configuration of the front, even if only in media terms, of course. 3,000 kilometers of range. If it were to be produced in mass, it would pose a significant threat to Moscow and to many major cities within the heart of Russia. But here we move on to the Russian response. So far, there hasn't been any official response, more like a media silence, which is usually the case with all of this. This is quite a common way for the Russian Federation to react to this kind of situation. Let's call it unconfirmed provocations, because for now they are just provocations on paper. Because the missile in question has not attacked any target within the Russian Federation, but the Russian Federation's secret services work very well. And if we here have some indications that behind the missile in question, more than Ukraine, it could actually be the West, well, in Russia, I assure you that this information is known in much greater detail, I mean, at the highest level of military intelligence. There are several possible scenarios here that once Ukraine shouldn't launch the missile, and that everything ends up being an immediate media victory that is forgotten in 2 days. The Kiev regime has used it exactly for the meeting with Trump, and that's it. The Russian Federation's lack of reaction was positive since nothing changed. I mean, to talk about nothing, it's better to spend this time talking about much more important things. Secondly, if Ukraine launches this missile, I have spoken here with military personnel who have already had contact with some response from the Russian Federation. In very strong terms regarding these escalation attempts, is it from Ukraine or from the West? I'm asking you all because it's still not clear who produces the missile, who's behind it. But I repeat, in the Russian Federation, they know exactly, if this information is true, who is ultimately behind the missile that was launched. And do you really think so? And I leave this completely open, and I hope that you will be the ones to clarify my doubt with your thoughts. Do you really think that the West is going to dare to? Ukraine attacks deep inside the territory of the Russian Federation with a missile that has Western help in its production? And if that's the case, what response will the Russian Federation have? Because I remind you that the last time they used it, and it's also been mentioned here, some military personnel have pointed it out to me. The last time the Russian Federation used the Erisnik missile, they did so without a real payload. So in response to the use of this Flamingo missile, assuming it does exist, that payload could indeed be added to the Erisnik. And the consequences, once again, would be infinitely more devastating for Ukraine.